Welcome back, class. We are still on neurology, and we're going to be looking at the neuron. Now, when we talk about neurology, we have two main types of cells. One is called the neuron, and the second type of cell is called a neuroglial cell. The neuron is the only one that is electrically excitable. Electrical messages can get conducted down a neuron, which is what we're looking at in this picture. The other type of cell is called neuroglial. If we look at the word, it's neuroglial, which means nerve glue. These are supporting cells all around the neuron. And there are different types of neuroglial cells. One is called a Schwann cell. There's a bunch of them, but we have Schwann cells, we have oligodendrocytes, we have astrocytes, we have microglial cells, we have ependymal cells, we have satellite cells. So these are some different types of neuroglial cells. Again, they're all structured different, so they all have different functions, but the neuron is the one that's only electrically excitable. When we look at a neuron has a few main key parts. And again, this should have been covered in AMP1 when we talked about the four types of connective tissues, right? We said there was epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. And under nerve tissue, we should have introduced to you at least the neuron, which has dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. Okay, dendrites, cell bodies, right? In the previous video, you heard me give definition of a nucleus and a ganglia, which was a group of nerve cell bodies. And then you heard me use the word tract or nerve, a group of axons, right? Either in the CNS or PNS. So you'll hear these terms, dendrites, dendra in Greek means branches. They look like branches of a tree. The cell body, also known as the soma. And then we have the axon. And impulses or nerve impulses travel down in this direction, of course, coming in through the dendrites into the cell body, and they move away through the axon. You'll hear this term here, Schwann cell. You'll hear myelin sheath. This already should sound familiar to you, the axon terminal and the synaptic end bulb. Why should that sound familiar? Because in AMP1, we talked about the neuromuscular junction, right? If this is muscle, here we talked about the nerve, the neuromuscular junction, what's happening right here at that gap. And then right here, these end bulbs or synaptic end bulbs, remember they store neurotransmitters. These synaptic end bulbs store neurotransmitters. The really important neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction you learned was acetylcholine. That was always excitatory. Okay. So the neuron is the main functional unit of the neural system. In your books, you typically hear the term, they'll say the nervous system. I just don't like to use the word nervous. So I interchange it with the word neural system. I don't want to be a nervous individual. So I refer to the nervous system as the neural system. But for our purposes, they're interchangeable. I believe in the power of words, so I prefer to use neural. These neurons have the capacity to produce action potentials. And I will send out a video this week to you that goes over action potentials, because this is what, in order to understand action potentials, we have to go through what's called neurophysiology. Neurophysiology. So I have a video on neurophysiology, and it goes over terms like depolarization and repolarization and action potentials and graded potentials. So please make the time to watch the neurophysiology. It's really all related to a nerve cell and what's going into it and what's exiting it in relationship to sodium and potassium. And when you did the cell, you probably learned about the sodium potassium pump. So it's going to revisit some of that. So the neuron is electrically excitable. There is a cell body that has the cell processes, the dendrites, and the axons. Within the cell body, there is a nucleus. There are Nissl bodies. These Nissl bodies are responsible for protein synthesis. Okay, they're made up of rough endoplasmic reticulum and free ribosomes. And remember, these are involved with protein synthesis. The protein synthesis in the neuron is really, really important for neurotransmitter production. Like, neurotransmitters like acetylcholine or GABA or dopamine and serotonin, right? These are all different types of neurotransmitters. So this has showed up in the past on one of the McGraw-Hill Connect quiz questions, and it's always looking at the highlighted structure, the one that looks a little bit different. So this is showing the neuromuscular junction, where this is muscle right here. What we have highlighted is the motor neuron, right? You heard me mention sensory neuron and motor neuron. At the neuromuscular junction, we're talking about a motor neuron. Okay. This right here, what we're looking at is at the very end, if this is the axon, and then we have this swollen tip at the end, right? This is the axon terminal, or where all those neurotransmitters are stored. So what you're seeing highlighted right here, those are synaptic vesicles. Those are synaptic vesicles. Now, what's stored in those synaptic vesicles are going to be neurotransmitters. Okay, so these are the synaptic vesicles in the presynaptic terminal. On this side, this is the postsynaptic. Okay, so now this is presynaptic, this is postsynaptic. What's that space between the both? Well, that's the cleft. That's the synaptic cleft. That's where, if you remember back to the neuromuscular junction, calcium had to influx in. Calcium influxed in and told these vesicles to move towards the end, open up, and through exocytosis, the neurotransmitter was released into that synaptic cleft. Okay. Okay, this is a neuron, but it's looking for what part of the neuron. So right here, that is the soma. Let's see if I can change the color here for a second. And let's make this black right here. So the axon hillock, that is this right here. That's the triangular dilated section right there. So that's the axon hillock, right? This here is going to be the axon, the rest of it, that's the axon. These right here, these are the dendrites. Okay, so now we're looking within the cell body. Within the cell body, these things right here, those are called nissl bodies. Those are going to be responsible for protein synthesis. The nucleus of the neuron, well, you can see that right there. That's the nucleus. This whole thing here is the soma. This right here is the axon hillock, and the rest of this is the axon. Everything else that we see around it, all of this kind of like meshwork around it, those are all neuroglial cells or neuroglial cells. All right, now here, that's the dendrites. Those are the dendra, the branches of the tree. So think of your hand, right? Let's say there's your thumb, one finger, two fingers, three, right? So you have your wrist and then you have your hand, okay? So think of this, right? These are your nails. So think of this as a neuron. This part would be your dendrites. Your palm is the cell body, and then this is the axon. So you have dendrites, you have your cell body, aka soma, and the axon. Right? All you got to do is look at your hand and your palm, and that would be the neuron. Right here, all right, we've hit that one already. That is the axon hillock. Now, what we're looking at here, let me go back here for a second to the neuron, to this. You see this Schwann cell right here? So this is, remember, the Schwann cell is a type of neuroglial cell. And what a Schwann cell does is it wraps around the axon and it insulates it. It wraps around and around and around and around. It keeps wrapping around, insulating it with this fatty cholesterol. And that fatty cholesterol substance is called myelin or myelin sheath. And the purpose of the myelin sheath is that it acts as an insulator. It speeds up the action potentials. It speeds up the electrical conduction to get to the end. So this myelin sheath or insulation is really, really important. Inside the body, we need vitamin B12 to make that, and we need a process within the body called methylation in order to make myelin. And methylation is really important on B9 and B12 and B6 in order to methylate properly. You need these three B vitamins to do that. And there are certain people that have a mutation called MTHFR, and I do have a video on this should you want to research it a little bit. It's called methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, which is the enzyme. Anything that ends in ase is an enzyme. Methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. There are many people that have this genetic mutation where they have this MTHFR, which means they have decreased enzymes to be able to produce the active form or the methylated form of folic acid or B9. And this is where we end up having a lot of neurological issues because B9 and B12 work really closely together, very closely together. In fact, if you look at some of the adverse reactions to a B12 deficiency, it looks like MS, which is multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is a disease where the body is attacking its own myelin sheath. It's breaking this down so that there's no insulation and the electrical conduction system starts to diminish. The action potentials, the way the speed of the action potentials going from the cell body all the way down the axon to the very end is diminished. We call that multiple sclerosis. It's an autoimmune condition against the Schwann cells or the oligodendrocytes, inhibiting the body's ability to produce myelin sheath. So just think of this as like an electrical cord. And whenever you look at an electrical cord, you don't necessarily, when you plug it in the wall, you don't see the wires. You see this insulation, either this black external protection over the wires or a white type of insulator going around it. But if that white or black insulation around the electrical wires wear down and you're exposed to it and you touch it, you can get shocked. Okay. So now when we go back to this, what we're looking at here in the inside is the axon, but what we're looking at in the yellow, that's the myelin sheath. That's the cholesterol. That's the fatty stuff. Okay. When we're looking at what's deep within it, well, this is an axon, but it's a myelinated axon because everything around it, which was here, that's the myelin sheath. Here, that's the axon or the myelinated axon. Now, let me go back again to that neuron. So in between each of these Schwann cells is a unmyelinated section called the node of Ranvier. So right there, that's a gap. Right here, there's a gap. Here, each of these is a gap. That's a node of Ranvier. Okay. Now when we go here, this space between this Schwann cell and this one, that's the node of Ranvier. Okay, so again, to review, we've covered our dendrites, we've done the cell body, and we've done the axon. The node of Ranvier is the space between each of the Schwann cells. From a cross section, you could see right here in the inside, right? You see all those neurofibrils, that's going to make up the axon. And then we see a Schwann cell wrapping around, wrapping around, wrapping around, producing the myelin sheath. That's the insulation. Okay. At the very, very end of the axon is the axon terminal with the synaptic end bulb at the very end, which stores the neurotransmitters. Notice the dendrites over here, these are typically unmyelinated, and the axons are usually myelinated. Impulses are conducted to the cell body by way of the dendrites. Dendrites are bringing information to the cell body, but over here, the axon is going to conduct the impulses away from the cell body. Okay, and then this portion right here is the axon hillock, right there. And just adjacent to the axon hillock is what they call the initial segment. The initial segment is where the action potential is initiated. The AP, or the action potential, is initiated. Way at the end, we have those swollen tips called the synaptic end bulbs. And again, they can contain these synaptic vesicles, typically acetylcholine, if we're talking about the neuromuscular junction. Now, still on neuron, we can classify neurons structurally or functionally. Functionally, the functional classification, this should sound a little bit familiar because I've already addressed at least number 1 and number 2. Number 1 are sensory neurons, which are afferent neurons. These are going to transport sensory information from, well, parts of the body like your skin and your muscles and your joints and sense organs. Whereas motor information, which is efferent, is going to send the motor nerve impulses to your muscles and your glands. Okay, now interneurons are the relay between the sensory and the motor. The connection between these two is going to be an interneuron. Okay, so if we look here at the spinal cord off to the right, this is a cross section, and everything inside the butterfly or the letter H here, this is called gray matter. So I'll put GM for gray matter. And then everything outside of it is white matter. What do I mean by gray matter and white matter? White matter is myelinated. Gray matter is not myelinated. Okay. Now, the other thing I also want you to understand, if I were to cut this in half this way, part of this is going to be dorsal, and the other half would be ventral or anterior. And there's a way to determine which is anterior and which is posterior. And the way we can tell is right here. This is a ganglia, which makes this nerve root here. This is a nerve root going into the spinal cord, and this is a nerve root coming out. If we compare these two nerve roots, this one is thicker, this one's thinner. The reason why this one's thicker is it has this ganglia inside of it. What's a ganglia? Is a group of nerve cell bodies in the PNS, in the peripheral neural system. So when you get this accumulation of nerve cell bodies, it's going to make this swollen ganglia. So this is called the dorsal root ganglia. If this is a dorsal root, if this is a dorsal root, if this is a dorsal root ganglia, then this is called a dorsal root. This is a ventral root. So the ventral root is motor, and the dorsal root is sensory. So what's happening in this picture, this is the skin, and we see a nail or a pointy thumbtack hitting it. So there are receptors in the skin. Remember, you learned about them. Pain receptors, Pacinian receptors, Pacinian corpuscles, pressure receptors. They're going to travel that information into the dorsal root through the dorsal root ganglia into the gray matter, and this is called the dorsal horn. These are horns. So that's a dorsal horn. Right here, that's a dorsal horn. If these are dorsal horns, guess what these are called? These are called ventral horns. This is a ventral horn. Right? Those are ventral horns. These are dorsal horns. So sensory information comes in through that dorsal root into the dorsal root ganglia into the dorsal horn. And it's going to relay that sensory information into this interneuron or association neuron, right? So functionally, there's a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and an interneuron, which is between the two. 90% of the neurons in the body are association neurons or interneurons. And again, that's what we see here in the gray matter. So this interneuron is going to relay that information into this motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to come out this way, go right to the muscle and makes it contract, pulling it away from that painful stimulus. So we got sensory information coming in this way, and we got motor information coming out this way. And the processing of it is taking place in that cord in the gray matter where the interneuron is. And again, gray matter is inside here. White matter is surrounding it. In the gray matter, there's going to be a bunch of nucleuses in here. And in the white matter, there's going to be a bunch of tracks. A bunch of tracks. So what are a bunch of tracks? Let's see. If here's the brain and here's the spinal cord, okay, we can have, change my color here for a second. Within the spinal cord, within the central neural system, right? Remember, information that starts at the brain comes down and goes out. Those are motor neurons. And then information that comes in the spinal cord goes up to the brain. Those are sensory. So you have sensory on the right, motor on the left. They're going to create tracks. Sensory tracks and motor tracks are located within the white matter. These are tracks that are going to go from the brain down the spinal cord, okay, or from the spinal cord up to the brain. And I have a video on these tracks and a separate video on the tracks and how to figure out if they're sensory or motor tracks. Now, not only is there functional classification, but now we have structural classification based on the structure, based on the number of processes found on the cell body. So on the left, A is a multipolar neuron. This is the neuron that we looked at before, where we have several dendrites and we have one axon. So we have lots of dendrites, one axon. It's a multipolar. These are the most common type of cells, nerve cells that we have are multipolar. Bipolar in the middle, B, bipolar is when we have one main dendrite, right? There may be many branches, but it's one dendrite coming off of the cell body, and it has one axon. So those are bipolar. These are with the special senses. So these are found in the eye and the ear and the nose, olfactory sense. So bipolar is going to be always sensory, okay, with the eye, the ear, and the olfactory. The unipolar, off to the right, what's interesting about the unipolar is that it starts off as a bipolar, right? And then what happens is this cell body right here pinches off. When it pinches off, when the cell body pinches away, this is unipolar. It's only one process and it develops from here. It's always sensory. Now look at this, and if we turn it sideways, right, it'll look like this, right? It looks like that. This is what we see right here. What we see that right here. So this is a unipolar neuron. What is it? The dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root ganglia. It's always sensory because even if we look here, right, you have that pin hitting the skin. We have sensory input coming in there. Sensory, sensory, sensory. Dorsal root ganglia. Unipolar neuron. Okay. When we look at this, this is a multipolar. We have the cell body. We have many dendrites coming off of it with an axon. This is our classical view. That is a multipolar neuron. Association or interneurons, these are named for the histologist that first described them, and sometimes they're also named by their appearance. So Purkinje fibers, Purkinje is after the histologist, but these pyramidal cells here, based on that shape, pyramid. So these are typically the interneurons or association neurons. Those relayers, those are going to be Purkinje cells or pyramidal cells. Good place to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into the neuroglial cells.